Dr. Yin, for your presentation and the important information that you presented. A lot of the work that we do is very much based on the importance of traditional ecological knowledge. And it's so important, the very last thing that you said about how to incorporate it into policy, which brings me to this one aspect that has been happening, but also a little bit runs the risk to forget a little bit about the traditional ecological knowledge that is so important from Indigenous communities. But I will share my presentation. Let's see here. Yes, so thank you so very much. Thank you so very much, Hasarat, for setting up this amazing possibility to share all of our research and work with everybody, and the amazing work that went into that. And thank you everybody for being here today. My name is Nejma Belarbi. I am North African by descent, and I now live in Cowichan territory, in unceded Cowichan territory in Canada, on Vancouver Island. I am, as my friend Shahidul was mentioning, I am a board director of the Grassroots Institute, and I am also a consultant with an organization that's called Terra Ethics, and we do work supporting collaborative design towards ethical sustainability. And we do a lot of work for equity in practice here that addresses equity issues globally. And some of the work that we do based on both equity and sustainability, ethical sustainability, is projects with Indigenous communities on the rights of nature and how to implement them. And so actually, what was so amazing about Dr. Yin's presentation at the very end, when he was talking about how to incorporate traditional ecological knowledge into policy, but also into scientific processes, and in academia, is one of the projects that has been happening here with the Indigenous communities in Canada, in Manitoba, is called Reconciling Ways of Knowing. And so that has been a very excellent bridge in the work that we're all attempting to do, I think. It's very new, but what we're seeing is that the rights of nature, which is a very much Indigenous worldview, coming into a larger platform, essentially. So I'm very honored to be here today with all of you and share some insights on this topic. So what are the rights of nature? So the rights of nature are based on inherent rights. Or fundamental rights of all beings. So that means that each being that is existent on this planet has equal value, essentially. And that is a very big part of of the work that we do and try to bring to organizations and so on, is trying to incorporate that very fundamental perspective. So this conceptual framework of the rights of nature is actually present in most traditional and indigenous worldviews, sciences and teachings. So across cultural research that I've done and many of my colleagues have done, like biocultural diversity, ecosystem, and the ecological lens, in my experience, also as an ethnobotanist, and through conversations, as a herbalist, many of the indigenous elders that I have spoken to in various territories, I have been able to see the thread of inherent rights, or inherent and equal value in most philosophical, spiritual, and practical teachings around the globe. But even in Cartesian science, where we are trying to start from the very, very basic into the whole, rather than looking at the whole and then seeing the thread, we are seeing the resurgence of an understanding of the symbiotic relationships in ecosystems. And it's actually very exciting because we're getting, we're finally getting through, Western science in seeing and recognizing the whole, right? And the different ways of knowing, and the importance of knowledge diversity. So the first Western mention of the rights of nature was written by Christopher Stone, and his essay, Should Trees Have Standing, which was written in 1972, was looking at how these inherent rights and inherent value of ecosystems, and trees in particular, for his case, could be put into through the lens of law, right? And so the rights of nature that are based on inherent and fundamental inalienable rights, which cannot be taken away, right, has now been used as a tool to bring balance between ecosystem legal personhood and industrial legal personhood. And so that is how that tool is now being used. So Thomas Berry, Dr. Thomas Berry, wrote about Earth Jurisprudence, which is a philosophy of law and human governance that is based on the fact that humans are only one part of a much wider community of beings, and that the welfare of each member of that community is dependent on the welfare of the earth as a whole, right? And one of the first principle is that rights originate where existence originates. And that is such an important missing piece in the trajectory and the pathway and all the work that we've been doing so far in the systems that have been created, are very much missing this very fundamental piece, which is now again trying to there's a resurgence of it. So essentially, the rights of nature have been used as a very big paradigm shift. So one of the things that one of the examples that I use in the context of Indigenous communities, of course, is, this started with the rights of Mother Nature in South America, where many countries were signatories into recognizing that nature had rights. And from there, which has been difficult because we are faced with a structure that is very, very different than that, because our whole economic system is based on extractive processes. And how do we mitigate the need for economic well-being and extractive processes with the rights of nature? And that has still been difficult. But there is, what we can say is, at least if the rights of nature are being recognized, then we can start to work with that, especially because of the concept of legal personhood. So in law, legal personhood, which are the rights that you and I theoretically have, and the right to live, the right to eat, the right to procreate, all of those things. But what's been very interesting is that the rights of nature, the legal personhood, has also been attributed to industry. And so that is something I'm going to talk about in a little bit here, but that has been why there has been such an imbalance, because and why the rights of nature have come as a natural response to industrial legal personhood, in order to bring the balance, so we can have, so that ecosystems who are being extracted by industry can have the same rights as industry, and there can be negotiations in the sense that that it's not about over extraction, but it's about balanced extraction. So in the context of climate change and mountain ecosystems and communities, and our subtopic of future strategies and policies, the rights of nature are changing our conceptualization of relationship with environment and management on a global level. I think that has been the one thing that everybody is talking about, and trying to remember that this is a big part of a paradigm shift in the way that we engage with environments, and that has been very important. So there are two issues here. One is the issue of equitable ecological governance for communities on a global level, and the lack of ecological relational lens in the dominant perspective. So in the main industrial dominant perspective. So from a rights of nature perspective, all beings, including ecosystems as a whole, have intrinsic value, and therefore laws to protect their rights can be used as binding instruments. So in this sense, it brings us closer to recognizing even our own intrinsic value, and shift the way we relate to ecosystems into rights-bearing entities rather than solely for exploitation, which would considerably change our resource management strategies. The work that we're doing is very much related to governance, however, in the rights of nature, which has not been something that has happened across the rights of nature movement necessarily, but definitely can be used as a tool. And so the relationship that communities have with ecosystems are what we're saying is that those are fundamental in the management, essentially, of the legal personhood. So the governing boards, but the way that we're trying to do it is that the governing boards, which is a replica of what happened in New Zealand with the Wanganui River, actually, although they, the way that they were able to attribute legal personhood rights to the Wanganui River was through a treaty process with the Crown. Now, that's not always, because different Indigenous communities work differently and have different relationships and so on with the Crown and the treaty process. But what they have done is that they have a governing body that speaks for the river and as the river, because they are, in a sense, so tightly related to the river and the ecosystem as kin and as, as family, as descendants of. Within their stories and their worldview and understanding. And so the governing board ends up being, by majority Indigenous and is led by the Indigenous communities and knowledge keepers of the territories that are to be recognized as rights-bearing entities in these ecosystems. Here in Canada, it's only happened in two places. Very recently with the Magpie River in Quebec with the Innu community, and they were able to have a unilateral declaration that declared that the river is a living entity and that it is a rights-bearing entity. And similar in another territory here in BC. But there, as you can imagine, because of the systems that we're living in, it is very difficult to implement this because it feels so theoretical to the majority of dominant culture, because there has been such a disconnect between that understanding and, of course, the culture that that we are engaging with and that many of us are part of. So yes. Sorry. Okay. So let's see here. Right. So the concept of legal personhood status in law. Again, I'm not a lawyer, I'm an ethnobotanist, but many of my colleagues are environmental lawyers from different areas of the world, and which has been really fantastic, and I've been learning a lot. But of course, my work is very much based on our connection to different, various ecosystems, and, working and actually bringing folks together, people together from different modalities in trying to work on this. But the concept of corporate legal personhood actually dates back to 800 BC. And it, one of the first recognitions, so it's a very, very normal, organic concept. I think that there was a time where I was very upset that industry had legal personhood. And then when I looked into the history of it, it actually made sense. And so the trajectory that we are going on also makes sense, I guess, in a sense. And so it started in 100 BC with guilds in India, and in the late Roman Republic continued this trend. And it made sense because collective entities, such as businesses, for example, or guilds, could enter into contract on their own and stay alive, right? Essentially, past the mortality of the individual that operated them, essentially. So in that sense, that makes very much sense. And so legal personhood of industry today serves the same purpose. It can enter into contract with others, it can acquire land, etc. But the issue we see today is that extractive industry is structured around profit. And we are seeing more corporate responsibility to an extent now, but I know it has been difficult for them as well. But especially, and a lot of the work that I think corporations are doing now to try to mitigate is, like carbon sequestration, for example, but also especially through funding streams in addressing conservation and equity issues, and so on. However, in this structure, corporations as legal persons can sue for loss of profit. So if you want to stop logging in an area, for example, which is something that is happening here on Vancouver Island, it's a breach of contract usually, and loss or profit or livelihood or income in the framework of legal personality, which also makes sense through the lens of law and protection of industry, but it makes it impossible to try to mitigate these over extractive practices, which I mean, to the detriment of many. One of the examples that I have here is we have this area here called Fairy Creek. It is one of the last old growth forests, temperate ecosystem. And some of the trees are, over 1,000 years old, and they are logging them so fast. And there has been a lot of protests, a lot of youth, a lot of Indigenous people, and there's been a lot of police brutality, which is, which a lot of people are very surprised about, because they're like, but it's Canada, how is this possible? And that is definitely something that is happening, because there is no leverage, as you know. And so one of the things that we're trying to talk about is trying to find ways to, not only incorporate, trying to find different mechanisms to support both the industry to, to flourish or shift, but also to support that these trees are actually irreplaceable. These ecosystems are irreplaceable and are also so valuable as carbon sequesters. But I digress. Sorry. I think that yeah, so that what I was just saying, that there's no leverage from ecosystems, and so we enter into this polarized situation between industry and conservation, or industry and Indigenous people, or farmers, farming, over-tilling and soil loss and so on and so forth, and and the world and so on. And so there is a cognitive dissonance between these two worldviews. And one of the things is that the rights of nature, which is a legal Western framework, is able to bring in Indigenous law and traditional ecological knowledge and worldview into the legal sphere. Am I over time?
I'm sorry, Mrs. Belarbi. To remind you, please finish within 3 minutes.
3 minutes. Okay, I will try to go as fast as I can. Thank you. Yes, so ecological legal personhood plays 3 roles. It defends an ecosystem as a rights-bearing entity, which can have a voice. It can enter into negotiations with industry. It can enter into contract with industry. So this is a very different framework. So, and again, one of the really important parts here is the relational lens, is how we relate to environment as rights-bearing entities. Again, we can enter into contract with ecosystems. That is, I think, one of the most novel idea. Also, ecosystems can have a seat in boards, essentially, both industrial and conservation boards, or municipalities or government even, at some point, maybe in my lifetime. And it brings in eco-literacy, which is very important. And so there has been, both binding and non-binding instruments, which I talk about here, as you can see. There's, tools for litigation, which has happened, and there has been a successful litigation against industry in Ecuador in particular. And, ecosystems become protected by law and have a standing in court, and so on and so forth. And the non-binding instruments are more about sort of paradigm shifts. Now, there is this, and I highly, I believe I have that in my, in my supporting material, but this is a map from, they're called the Earth Law Center, who are our colleagues, and it shows you in the world where the rights of nature have been implemented. Again, the absence of the rights of nature has or the intrinsic and fundamental value and relational engagements with environments, has caused a lot of the issues that we are seeing here, which is causing a direct effect to climate change, but also to inequity in the world, which continues. So I guess one of the rights of nature and equity are actually based on the same issue, and that's a lot of the work that we're doing. And we're trying to bring to light this fundamental lens, which again is very ecologically based and ecosystems based, in a way to try to bring us full circle back to acknowledging the shared space that we have with all other beings on this planet and how we related to sustainabilities. And we always end with laws are a good tool, but the shared perspective that drives them delivers the outcome. So thank you for this time. I had perhaps a few questions that can be looked at in trying to sort of critically think about how the rights of nature could be applied, or where do they fit in the work that we do collectively in the different sectors that we are in. And yes, thank you so very much.
Thank you, Mrs. Nejma Belarbi, for your nice and very interesting lecture. We have learned many things from the above lecture. Now the lecture